Database integrity and security, and in this course we are covering database security, chapter number 6, password profiles, privileges, and roles. Now this chapter is talking about all three different databases that we have covered so far, including MySQL, Microsoft SQL Server, and Oracle. Now the objective of this chapter is to define the authentication, then implement the SQL Server, MySQL, and Oracle, and define the authorization, and then implement with SQL Server, MySQL, and Oracle, and manage users based on security best practices in order to protect the data on our databases, and then identify and apply the password best practices which are known. Then define and create the roles using the SQL Server, MySQL, and Oracle, and then very important commands that we have in a database called define, grant, deny, revoke privileges using SQL Server and MySQL. Now as you can see, they are repeatedly saying that all of these options are the same in all databases. Talking about SQL Server, MySQL, and Oracle, it means that the basic security infrastructure is almost the same. They make minor changes in the wording of it or the kind of commands that you pass in order to process the things, in order to create the accounts, in order to have privileges levels on the databases, who must have full access and who is a general user. But the basic framework is almost the same, because whenever we are dealing with the databases, authentication plays an important role. And when we say authentication, we have authentication and authorization, both things. A process of confirming the identity of an individual requesting access to a secure environment. Of course, a database could be a secure environment. Your accounts, wherever you are authenticated, is done by verifying the login credentials, match those created within that environment. So when we were creating the when we were setting up the database, we had a mixed mode in all databases. Like it was relying on authentication of Windows, especially SQL Server, or you can have separate username and passwords for the database. Now, login object mapped to a user account within the database associated with the user security identifier, SID. It's the same practice that we have in Active Directory and in Microsoft accounts. So every account has a SID, which is security identifier. Even your mailboxes which are there on Microsoft Exchange server, every user will have a unique SID. It's so unique that even if I'll delete an account today of a user, and if I'll create it again tomorrow, there will be a different SID, though the name, username, ID number, and rest of the things are exactly the same. Because it wants to distinguish each user, and each user would have its own SID, which is quite unique, and no other user would have anything even matching that thing. Now the default logins are created using the database. Installation must be managed correctly. Now the credentials are pieces of information used to verify the identity. An example of credentials are person's username and password, application secure ID, which you can define on the database itself, type of credentials used to verify the identity depending on the authentication process of a particular system or environment. SQL Server would be relying either on the Windows-based authentication, or it would have its own username and password separate. A known practice is that for SQL Server, people love having the Windows-based authentication, but I am a little bit against that, because if your password of the computer is compromised and a user is logged in, he'll be logged into the database as well without any hassle. But if you have a separate username and password for your database, it gives you a second layer of protection, that if someone has gained access and unauthorized access to your machine, he won't be able to do anything on your database. Now, especially if you are an administrator and you have the full access on the tables to read the data, delete the data, drop the tables, create users, then it becomes very dangerous if you have a Windows-based authentication. Authentication can be verified a few times at a different level during a single logon attempt. Third-party applications can add security to authentication process. Now, security to authentication process means that your password would be encrypted. It's not like it would be a simple password, clear text, which would be flowing on the network. They may use password encryption to keep network environment secure. 3 levels of authentication are there in a database. First of all, operating system level means that the username and password that you have on the operating system. Then you have a database level security, and you have a third-party support, like if it's encrypting or if you're using a third-party tool to encrypt the passwords, or you're using a third-party tool to generate difficult passwords. Now, credentials authentication primarily through the operating system account must reside on the operating system. Means that the username and password is there on the operating system. Account credentials must be used to access the system. In some cases, operating system login alone can be used to authenticate the users on the database. Just like we saw in SQL Server, that it was a Windows-based authentication. Advantages are convenience of the user, centralized user account administration. User must have access to the local database account to check credentials and gain access. Users may be required to access several systems before reaching the database. It means it's not a direct access to the database. You'll be authenticated at first place, then at the second and the third, depending on the kind of environment they are. So not like if you're sitting on the computer, you'll be easily getting access to it. Just like if we have a database not in our organization, somewhere else, far from the local organization, first of all, in order to access that SQL server, you need to request the security team to allow you access to that machine. Once that's done, they'll take your IP address and the MAC address, and then they'll take the IP address of the remote SQL server, and they'll allow you access to that. Now, since now you have the access to that server, it does not mean that you'll be able to log in. You'll have to request the username and password separately on the SQL server. Once that's granted, they'll check that if you can easily authenticate or not, and then they'll define the timings when you are allowed to access those services or not. Now, the challenges are user must keep different credentials for different systems. Difficulty often leads to weak passwords or poor password practices. It's never a good practice, and Microsoft, if we'll define the policies on the Active Directory of enforcing the difficult passwords, etc., it would make sure that you have complex passwords of alphanumeric, having a numbers, alphabet, special characters, minimum length of the password, and the username should not be included in the password, and all those different things. Then you can have a policy that the password would expire, for example, in 30 days or 60 days. So the user is required to change the password on regular intervals. Now, if you are changing a password on regular intervals, you must have a plan or a strategy on which you are keeping your passwords. You must have a combination of alphanumeric characters depending on the website, dates, area, and different. You can define your own pattern on which you will be changing the password. So if you have a set pattern through which you are aware of it only, you'll be able to guess it easily that if I change the password last month, what it would be. So you don't need to note it down somewhere, and it becomes easy for you to manage your own passwords without using any password manager. Administration is more difficult with separate accounts. Can be used now. Network and third-party authentication can be used for remote or physical environment. User not required to have an account on operating system or database. Must have network account recognized by the third-party application. Type of external authentication is PIN card. Kerberos, which is a authentication method on Active Directories, and then public key encryption and digital certificates. So if they are issuing you a smart PIN or a Kerberos or a public key or a digital certificate, That's quite unique in its nature, that they know and they can verify your identity. Once that's done, they'll authenticate you based on those things to the databases. Now, the reason of using these things is that if a employee is, for example, leaving an organization, or he's doing a clearance and stuff, if they'll take the PIN number or the smart card, or they'll cancel the accounts in the system like that, there are zero chances that he'll be able to access it again. So it's a single place of control where they'll be clearing the person who's leaving the organization on the clearance process, and would take all the things which would give him access on any kind of system. Third party or external authentication not recommended for use alone, so there is a combination of it. The second level of security. For example, in the secure areas in the data centers, you need to show your card, and then you'll have to use the biometrics as well, or biometrics and a PIN code. Combination of that would give you access to that thing. Can be combined with operating system and server authentication. Now, database vendor specific authentication components are the SQL Server authentication information. Server uses Windows authentication and mixed mode. So it can have both. You can have Windows based authentication as well as your own username and password. Users logging into the database must have Windows login to access, known as trusted authentication, recommended trusted authentication for SQL Server, because it would read the username and password which is there for the account. Since it has the administrative access, you will be able to authenticate to the SQL Server using that. Now, if you are relying on the authentication methods of Microsoft, we have another thing like LDAP. Through LDAP as well, we authenticate lots of services. Your accounts on Blackboard, or even an open source system which is Moodle, which you will be installing as part of the project in this course, can be authenticated on Microsoft platform without creating an account. Now, Moodle is an open source course management system. It has its own username and passwords as well. But if you want to integrate that Moodle system to Microsoft Active Directory, like the username and passwords that you have at the moment, you don't need to define any privileges or accounts separately to the users. User will be able to authenticate themselves using the same username and password. All you need to do is define that if they would have the administrative access on that or not. Now, mixed mode authentication allows both Windows authentication and SQL Server authentication to be used to obtain the database access. Known as an untrusted connection, not a secure Windows authentication protocol such as Kerberos cannot be used, because it is Windows based and it should be used only within the required parameters. Now, MySQL authentication information, 3 pieces of information used to verify, for example, the host name, MySQL username and password. Oracle authentication information supports many authentication options. Database servers, database links, environment passwords can be used as credentials. Additional security applications are available. Now, advanced security, comprehensive security applications encrypt and transmitted the stored information, provide strong proxy authentication strategies. So, you are required to have the passwords, and they make sure that once they'll travel on the network, they are properly encrypted, so that even if someone is capturing the packets in the middle, they won't be able to decode the authentication relay. Middleware applications designed to monitor the external request for the database access. Maybe you want to give access to a remote vendor who will be accessing the database for certain things, to check the accounts, or to check the inventory, not the accounts, that how much stock is available before they'll dispatch anything. So you'll have to give them application access to those databases using middleware applications. Now, of course, the access to those databases will be through a web-based application, which you'll access it from the internet. You'll have a separate username and password. You can have all sort of security credentials on it, that who's accessing it, from where, when, and what's the IP address. Database linking feature that enhances the authentication support. Link between the two databases, resulting in a logical storage unit. Enables by applying the policies. Links can be public or private to authentication method, current user, and connect user. So the policies for the internal users will be different than the policies for the external users. There are some accounts of the administrators and system administrators and the database administrators, which would work only if you are within the environment. If you'll try to access the same database from a remote location outside your network, you won't be able to access them using the same username and passwords. Now, most intrusions originate from the cracked or stolen passwords. Password policy implementation. Organization first defense against the compromised passwords can be enforced within the database server application more effective than a written policy. Both written and server defined policies should be used to maximize the effectiveness. So one security policy is there, which is there on SQL Server or Windows domain, to have alphanumeric passwords, special characters and stuff. Second policy is the written policy that the organization have for the users. It includes the policy to change the passwords on regular basis and things related to that. Now, if someone would gain access to an account and he'll see that the person is not keeping a very strong password, you can get an idea that what kind of password that person might have kept. And that gives you an idea that how you'll control it or how you can try different passwords, just like we mentioned it earlier in the morning in another course. Now, password policy options are often vendor specific. Most server applications share similar configuration settings. 4 password attributes can enforce in every database. For example, complexity, failed attempts, expired passwords, and password reuse. Now, complexity is, as we discussed, it's alphanumeric passwords, which you can have different characters, special characters, symbols, and stuff. Failed attempts is that it would lock out your account if you'll have 3 unsuccessful failed attempts, for example. Or expired passwords, that if the password is not used for X number of days, it would automatically disable the password. Password reuse is that if you had a password in this month and you have changed it next month, and after the second month, on third month, if you would like to have the same password, it would remember the old passwords and it won't let you keep this password that you have used before. Now, that depends on the policy as well, that how many previous passwords it would remember in the database before you can reuse them. Now, written policies include the equipment usage agreement between the organization and its employees. It's just a policy within the organization for using different things. Usage agreements must be flexible enough to be consistently enforced and strict enough to ensure user abide by the policy, that you are not sharing your passwords. Now, how to make sure that users are abiding the policy is by keeping an eye on the overall access and what people are doing on the databases or on a network environment. Just like we keep an eye that how many logins or successfully users are logged in using a single user account. And it has been noticed over the period of years that students usually share their username and password with their students, and we end up finding that one user account is used on 6 or 7 computers simultaneously. Now, there could be multiple reasons for that. First of all, maybe the account is compromised. Second thing is maybe the student is sharing that password. Third is maybe an application is saving it somewhere and it's using it inside the system to authenticate itself, and it's downloading some stuff. Now, common standards like to be included in an equipment usage agreement, for example, password discretion, password sharing, and storage. Now, the vendor-specific password management in SQL Server policy is available, having a very strong password policy methods, password complexity, expiration, and enforcing the password policy. SQL Server password complexity requirements are password should be unique and include in the common reserved words, should not include any common or reserved words or username. Length must be 8 to 128 characters, can include underscore, $, numbers, and special characters, etc. It must include at least one digit and a alphabetic character. Sometimes they enforce even that an uppercase and lowercase means all different combinations should be there, cannot begin with a number. So you'll have to have an alphabet first, followed by a number, uppercase, lowercase, and then these special characters, etc. MySQL policies, administrators must rely on the operating system and third-party applications. Then stored in 45-bit encryption in a user table. So if in MySQL Server, you'll choose a password, you'll set it up, and then if you'll go to the users table and if you'll click on the password field, you'll find all scrambled data over there. You won't be able to read the password from it. Even if you'll type in the password in the field and save it, it would encrypt it again, so that if someone would get access to that table, they won't be able to read what's written in the passwords. Now, passwords are case sensitive, vary in length, and can include special characters. Now, nowadays in most of the applications, not only the passwords are case sensitive, even the usernames are case sensitive, where they make sure that if you are typing admin, A should not be capital. So if you defined a username with a lowercase a and you are typing admin, it should be in the lowercase, and at the end of the username there should be no extra space which would be checked. Now, Oracle password policy stored the encrypted DBA user table. So that's a table in which it's managing all users. Server built-in password protection services, for example, case sensitivity and password hashing. Now, Oracle password complexity requirements are password should be unique and cannot include simple words, server names, usernames, server or usernames with numbers appended, length between 8 to 128 characters. Now, as you can see, they are constantly talking about, first they talked about SQL Server, then they talked about MySQL Server, and now they are talking about Oracle. So as far as the quizzes are concerned, you must have at least this information, that what's the difference between different databases and how they are managing the password complexity. What's the character length, what are the requirements, and where are the password stores. A new password must differ from the previous password, must include at least one digit, alphanumeric, cannot begin with a number, can include underscore or a $, can begin with a special character or $, hash sign, or the password surrounding the quotes. Now, they are showing this Oracle password related functions, like if you are getting failed login attempts, default setting is 10, number of allowed failed login attempts before the account is locked. So if you are getting a message called failed login attempts, it means that someone who's trying to enter the password, he entered a wrong password 2 or 3 times and it has locked the account. Password lifetime 180 days. So in 180 days that password is valid. After that, automatically it would expire. Password reuse time unlimited, number of days must pass before the password can be reused. Unlimited, but usually it's changed so that the user cannot use the same password again. Password reuse maximum limit is defined. Password lock time, a number of login attempts, it would keep the account locked, for example, for 1 minute, 5 minutes, or 10 minutes, and then automatically it would unlock the account. You can set this time limit yourself. It's the same thing in Windows-based authentication systems, that if someone is trying a wrong password for X number of times, his account will be locked out and will be unlocked automatically after the time limit that is defined. Now password grace time is 7, which is number of days ahead of expiration that the user is warned. So whenever the user would try to log in, it would show a warning that your password is expiring in 7 days, so change the password as soon as possible. Now authorization process of applying the permission to a user ensures that user requesting the access to have permission to do so. So he is allowed to log into that system and perform certain operations. As we told you that different users will have different level of access. Some will be able to run different queries, some will be able to only read the data, the other will have full access who can manage the users, delete the tables, create the tables, check the security of the database, and different configurations. Determine prior to the use obtaining the authentication credentials, choosing the most appropriate privilege for each user help maintaining a healthy and secure database. So if it's a database entry operator only who wants to enter the data in the database, he'll be given a default basic level access through which he can perform his duties. With the passage of time, if his role grows and he needs more access to the system, he'll be granted permissions based on the requirements of his job. User account management, users management task, add and remove or assign the privileges to the users. So you don't need to create a new user for any privileges, you just add the privileges to that users so that he can access other things which were not allowed on his account before. Just like on student's account, we don't need to create a new user account if we want to have a student on the help desk for helping the students in resetting the passwords, etc. We'll give a normal access on a specified container where the student will be able to change passwords of other students with a elevated privilege, but that would be temporary. You can add and remove the role from his account anytime. Administrator can understand default user account privileges created during installation of the database management. So whoever installed the database will have the default username and passwords, or if he has defined any username and password during the installation process. As you saw when we were installing SQL Server and when we were installing the Oracle Server, we defined some username and password during the installation process. Now, default user accounts are created with predefined user access, true for virtually any type of database. So it would install the database with the default settings. Later, you'll have to spend a lot of time in order to define the privileges, account permissions, and settings on a database. Default password, username, and rights. Privileges can easily be found online. Need to secure the default accounts to protect the data. So once you finish the installation of any database, you can find the best practices in order to protect your database online, and you can follow the best practices and can enforce it. Now the best practices which are available are different for every environment. So they are telling you the best practices. It does not mean that necessarily you'll involve or you'll implement all of those features on your network. You'll choose the kind of users you have, the kind of business you have, and then you'll set up the permissions accordingly. Default users installed with SQL Server, 2 administrator accounts are there, for example, SA and built administration, 1 generic public account as a guest, which is usually disabled as soon as the installation is complete, because you don't want any external user to gain access to your database using a guest account just to read what is there in the database. Default user allowed with MySQL, 2 root accounts are there, 2 anonymous user accounts, no password are set immediately, should be assigned during the installation. So even if you leave it empty, it would proceed like that. But if you intend to use the same database for the production purposes, it's responsibility of the database administrators to take care of all those things and set up the passwords accordingly. Now default users installed with Oracle, or number of type of the default accounts can vary greatly depending on the installed application features and additions. So what your database is used for, whether it's used for data warehousing or transaction processing or real-time data, most accounts created to expire are to be locked after installation. So you must know that these are the accounts which are set to expire after a certain number of days. 3 account options open for use after installation. As we saw it when we were installing it on Oracle, we selected sysman or sysadmin or system. Always change the default password of a new user or force password change prior to the server entry. So if you log into a default password, it should show you a pop-up window that you are required to change the password. Just like if we create accounts for the students, we give a default username and password, and then once the student would log in for the first time, he'll be prompted to change his password. Save the user password is encrypted file and enforce the strong password policies. Use different login and passwords in different applications and ensure that the user read and agree to the database usage policies. So in most of the environments, when a user is going to log into the system, as long as he'll reach the login screen or once he will log in, he'll get a pop-up screen with the default policies which you can read, which are defined by the organization that you are allowed to do these things and you're not allowed to do certain things. Before removing a user to perform the inventory of the user created objects, recommended to disable a user account instead of deleting it. Maybe that account is a service account and it is being used by any application in order to gather the data. So if a user leaves, maybe he was a programmer, he was developing an application based on his user account rather than creating a service account. So it's recommended that if a user left the organization, disable the account and then check after a period of time that if any services or any applications are stopping. If that's the case, you can then further investigate in order to find out that which thing is actually stopping it, and then you can remove rest of the information and keep the details of that specific account, or create an account which is meant for services and redirect the services to be authenticated using that service account. Now, documentation is the most important thing for adding and deleting the accounts. It is the same when you are creating the accounts or in a programming. That's why you always provide the documentation during the programming process as well, so that any variables or anything that you are defining, it could be easily understood by any other programmer who will be reading the code and would be trying to make the changes to it in the future. Now, user privileges is the smallest unit of authorization, ability to access a specific resource to perform a specific action. But it has a very high impact on the kind of data and information that you find in the database. Example of privileges are deleting the rows, creating a table, executing a procedure. Now, deleting a table is a very huge command and you don't want to give it to a user who don't know how to manage it. Maybe he'll end up deleting a table which would have quite confidential or important information inside the table. Privileges should be planned out in the early stages of the database planning. Principles of least privileges is security standard. A standard account which is created would have the policies according to that standard account. Each user given minimum set of privileges needed to conduct legitimate business within the system. Daily operations that they are doing. Managing the user privileges or granting the privileges and then denying the privileges or revoking the privileges. 2 ways to grant the privileges is to fix and a single statement. 3 levels of permissions can be granted, for example, server level, database level, or the object level. Can grant the object permission to individual users and roles, and privileges can be a single statement. Now, assigning a privileges in MySQL is at a 5 level. For example, global privileges, which is the privilege for the entire database. Then the database privileges specific to the tables which you have inside. Global privileges defines what kind of character set you are having. If it's a INNODB, or you are having MySam or any kind of database structure. Database object privileges are the tables which are inside it. Column object privileges are specific to the columns and the things inside the tables, and the routine privileges are the general privileges that you have. Grant command is used to provide access to the privileges and will create a new user or non-existent. Now the table, for example, in MySQL is a user contains the global privilege information that can access the user on the SQL server. DB specifies which user can access the MySQL database. So on the left hand side there is a table name, and by using the table name you can understand what are the privileges to that user. So if you see a table user, it would have all the users and their account information. DB is for the specific users who can access the database. Then table privileges are identify the users who can have access to those tables in a database. Column privileges identify the users who can access columns in a table. And then we have prox privileges identify which users are permitted to execute individual stored queries, etc. Now assigning the privileges in an Oracle is a two level of privileges. For example, a system level and an object level. Administrators can grant the system level privileges. Object privileges are granted by the schema owner of the object, that who must be able to access which table in the database. As we discussed earlier, that we have different departments using the same database, so each user will have access to the specific database or object which he is entitled for. Privileges can be granted to public, grant privileges to all database users, not recommended for security reasons. So we'll stop it over here and we'll continue it in our next lecture.